Welcome back everyone to the third episode in the Minecraft Ideas Academy series. Each video will cover a different aspect of game design that is specific to suggestions and vanilla style mods. Today I'm joined by Zoe.
Hello.
And we're going to talk about some game design principles relevant to Minecraft.
We'll be summarizing a book written by Jesse Schell in 2008, which might seem like it's outdated, but because it's all foundational game design, it will still mostly apply to games being made today, even sandbox games and things like that. It's called The Art of Game Design.
Yep, and we'll have a link to the PDF in the description. It's free, anyone can read it, and if you are more interested in going deeper into the stuff that we talk about, or stuff that you feel we might have missed out because it's not necessarily related to Minecraft, you can always have a look in the PDF. It's a very accessible book. And also one more thing is, these rules, especially the ones that we're going to say for Minecraft, these aren't hard and fast. Game design is all about creating an experience, and if you can create an experience and you have to by breaking the rules, well, that's just another design decision that you have to make when making stuff.
Yep. I would say that the experience is also the essential component of a game. So the experience of Minecraft would be maximizing creativity in an environment that is gamified. If you want to apply that to other games, then you would say the experience of Zelda Breath of the Wild is to explore. The fundamental experience of Doom is to feel like an action shooter. And that's basically what we mean when we're saying that the purpose of a designer is to create an experience.
Yeah, and Minecraft is also, it's a game and it's also a sandbox, so it's not something as complex as Blender or any other tool that you might use to actually create stuff that isn't related to a game. But Minecraft is still a game as well as a sandbox, and especially the differences between creative and survival. Survival is a lot more gamified because it requires you to earn that power fantasy of being able to maximize your creativity.
Awesome. So today we're going to be talking about many things that go into the design process. These will be covering the topics of iteration, prototyping, different kinds of players, something about flow channels. We'll be talking about game mechanics, RNG, balance, rewards and punishments, and we'll finish up with the design team, probably for making mods or just developing games as well. Like, this doesn't have to just apply to Minecraft.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing that we need to do is figure out what the experience of Minecraft is and how we can add to that experience and keep it consistent with that experience.
Yeah, so the experience of Minecraft we already established is maximizing creativity in a game and environment. So if you wanted to make like a mod or suggest an update to Minecraft or even make a game of your own, the first things that you have to do is list the experience you want to deliver on. So let's say we want to give players the experiences of mastery over a creative game world. I think that applies to Minecraft pretty good. And then what you do is that you take that overall goal and then you rephrase it as a problem. And you look for problems which get in the way of that experience. So in Minecraft you might say that grinding prevents experienced players from having agency over the world they exist in. So that's a problem that would get in the way of your experience. And so once you have that problem statement, the goal then is to create something which solves that problem. And you solve that problem by iterating through various ideas until you get close to the goal and fulfill it. And that's how you stop iterating.
And a lot of things that I see in the gaming suggestion community is people suggesting stuff and then there's not that backing behind it, so they say, oh, this might be cool. Whereas if you start with the problem and then figure out the solution, you've got a much more strong direction in which to take your ideas instead of just suggesting stuff just because.
Yeah, and once you've got your idea, that's when the iteration process starts. So I've got 8 questions that you should ask yourself before you go through with an idea. And the first question is based on artistic impulse. Does it feel right? If you're suggesting something like guns or lasers, does that really feel right? Like, it might address the problem, but if it doesn't fit in the environment that you've created, then it's probably not worth continuing with. The next question would be demographics. Will this intended audience like it? So if you're making something for combat players, then you need to make sure that the combat players will like that. The next question would be experience. Is your idea well designed? And we'll go over what makes well designed later on. The next idea would be innovation. Is the idea actually original? Maybe you've got some like ores that you want to add, like to make a cave update or something, but if you've added like ruby ore and all it does is make a new tier of pickaxe, then that doesn't really pass the innovation test. Another question would be, will the idea sell? Now, in the context of Minecraft, sell just means will people use this thing or want to download your mod. Then you need to ask yourself if the idea is actually possible. There might be some kind of technical limitation that you have which prevents you from implementing your idea.
I made a video essay a while ago, which was how to improve Minecraft scaffolding. And at the time, I didn't like the horizontal distance limit of scaffolding because people might just stick to using dirt or slime blocks or something else that's easy to put up and get rid of, just like you'd use scaffolding for. The problem is my idea suggested having base blocks, and there's functionality very similar to that in the game. For example, chorus fruit, they all stem from one thing that's attached to the ground, except if you try and place another and try and attach them together, it won't let you. And I imagine they made that decision because there's so many things that are close to it. Another example would be redstone. You can have two power sources, and you can kind of imagine those power sources would be things where the base power comes from. Except that once you have two, you've got like things that power themselves, which wouldn't make sense if scaffolding was to support itself, etc. So there's so many things that are close to the idea, and I thought with all these different things that were so close to it, I could just put them together. But so far, I haven't actually been able to create something that would actually be possible for that to happen. That might not have been the best explanation, but that's one example, I suppose.
Yeah, it's a good example of where engineering can get in the way of a good idea. But moving on, the next question you would ask yourself is, does the idea meet your social community goals? This isn't exactly necessary, this is pretty optional, but it does help if your idea has visual appeal, character, meme potential, all those things that community members can interact with. And then the final thing that you want to ask yourself is, do the playtesters like it? And if they don't, and you've got this far, then the chances are that you just need to make some minor changes to your idea until your players will like it, and that's just through iterating a new idea just over and over again until they pass all 8 of those requirements. So, iterating can be really difficult if you have a big idea, which is why prototyping is important. In prototyping, you got to make something really quick. No fancy visuals, no audio, just raw mechanics that you can test really quickly. It should take you about an hour or two. The more times you iterate your prototype, the better it will get. And then you finish your prototype once it solves your problem statement that you've come up with. But if you have an idea that's absolutely massive, and the prototype will take hours to make, then you need to do a risk assessment. So you need to list down everything that might not work about your idea. Like, this might not be fun, this might not solve the problem, all kinds of things like that. And in order to mitigate those risks, you have to do a couple things, like test it out on paper. Did you know that Tetris was made on paper before they started programming it? Same with Doom. And what they had was little cardboard pieces that were acted out. Other members of the team were acting out the AI, and it was just fun on paper before they migrated and started actually programming the thing. And another way to create a quick prototype is, don't even make a game that's functional, just create a toy that's nice to play with. For example, just the Riptide Trident, even if it's useless, even if it doesn't quite solve your problem yet, if it's fun to play with, then that's probably a really good foundation to start off with. Another thing you should do is have lots of prototypes at once, if you can. That way you can have 10 really quick things that you put together, and then you pick the best and you can run with that. So always pick a fast loop game engine. In my case, if I wanted to make a mod where creepers don't spawn in the desert, I would actually start off by using command blocks first. I would go to the desert and I would just teleport every creeper underground and then test that to see if it works. And if it doesn't, then I've only wasted like 10 minutes of my time. But if it does work, then that's great and I can continue developing. Do you have anything you want to say about prototyping?
Yeah, absolutely. Same with mCreator. If you're not, I know a lot of people don't like it, but if you only use it for testing out your ideas, well then that's time that you've saved, and that's a net positive. If you've tested something out just by building it in a program where you don't need to code, don't need to do that, just for the purposes of testing, it doesn't need to be absolutely well polished. It doesn't need to be ready to ship out. As long as you can test it and get an idea of whether it's good or not, that's a good way to design stuff. Also, we can also see ways that Mojang have tried to test their product beforehand. For example, they use a software development cycle called Agile, and they use the idea of the minimum viable prototype. So you get something out, and then once you've got the base thing out, you can start adding to it. And at any point, you could ship it and say, you know, this is good enough, even though it might not be as good as you want to. At least it works and it does something. And the way that they come up with those prototypes is something called user stories. So, for example, the Nether update, they can cater to different demographics or players. So there might be a technical builder who's like, I need a ton of quartz for my machine, and I heard that piglins can barter that, so could I automate it? How hard would it be to scale? Would I need to do it AFK? Could I grind? Etc, etc. How that would work. Then there's the peaceful mode players, the people who just want to slash and kill stuff. Hardcore mode players, people who want to start in the Nether. All these different ways of playing, and how the Nether update content was able to accommodate those. That's all stuff that you can test out really quickly just by kind of imagining how players would play and then designing your stuff around that.
You were talking about player types just then, and I think that brings up a good point. You should pretend that you're your audience in order to practice deep listening, and you have to ask why about everything. Why do peaceful players like peaceful mode? And then their answer to that would also be followed by another why question, and you keep asking why to get to the root of what they really want until you can't ask anymore. Like the Strider, for instance. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, well, we saw a lot of people asking for some sort of boat that could travel on lava, and, you know, that doesn't satisfy our out of the iteration cycles innovation. Is the idea novel? Well, no. The idea of a boat on lava is just a boat on water, except that it works on lava. That's not very creative. It doesn't change how lava travel works in opposition to water travel. But the developers asked why. Why do people want a lava boat? And the answer was so that they could get across lava lakes and lava oceans more easily in the Nether. So the developers are like, okay, how can we make this different? And then the Strider was born.
So something to keep in mind when we're talking about demographics, we talk about player types. Sure, you can target for age and gender and things like that, but it's generally better to aim for things like achievers, explorers, socializers, and killers, things like that. In the case of Minecraft, it would be like the technical community, the combat community, just things like that. And also, keep in mind the various pleasures that are associated with each demographic. So, I'm actually just going to list them all one by one. So, game pleasures include things like using your senses. We like to hear things and look at things. Being in an imaginary world. Even if the game is terrible and mechanically boring, if you've constructed a really nice imaginary world, then players will still enjoy it for that reason. There's narrative, challenge, cooperation, discovery, free expression, submitting yourself to the world. I guess you could say that's immersion, but I'm a bit hesitant to use that word. There's anticipation of pleasure. When you build a portal for the very first time, and you go in there and there's all these effects and it's really mysterious. That's anticipation that something's going to happen. There's delight in the misfortune of others, which mostly applies to like traps and things. Gift giving, people love giving things to each other. There's humor, like the piglins dancing after they kill a hoglin. Having choices is a pleasure, but only if it's done well. You can experience decision fatigue sometimes if there are too many choices. So a good way to avoid that is to heavily imply that one choice is superior to the other. So you still get the pleasure of having the choice without it inhibiting the player's mind. We'll talk a bit more about that later when we touch on Flow Channel. Other pleasures include pride, purification. That's like when you you eat all the dots, or you deplete the cave entirely, or you organize your inventory. That's a purification pleasure. There's surprise. Now, surprise can still happen for experienced players, but only through emergence, which we'll also touch on later. Triumph over adversity, and wonder. So those are the basic pleasures. There's probably more, but that's the basic list.
Yeah, if you want more information on those, you can always navigate to the Art of Game Design book. If you want to have elaboration on those, you can search them up on the PDF and get a better idea of what they're for. But the ones that are specific to Minecraft, I see more. Pride is definitely a big one, especially if you're a builder or redstone, or even if you've just made some sort of, if you've just achieved something, for example, getting a trident, or killing the Ender Dragon, killing the Wither, etc. There's not too many goals in Minecraft that make you really proud, which is why you're encouraged to make your own.
Also keep in mind the flow channel. That's just a basic concept where players will be really engaged in your game if it's not too anxiety inducing and if it's not too boring. You have to be somewhere in the middle for that to work. And part of that is through decision making. There was this one time I was playing Minecraft. Decision fatigue is something that happens to me a lot when there's just too many choices. But there was this one time I was working on something and then a thunderstorm started. And I happened to have a channeling trident. So the game basically made the decision for me, you have to go get some heads. Obviously I didn't have to, but the choice was heavily implied by the game. So I went and did that. And I got a couple heads. An hour had passed by this point. And then I saw some pillagers in the distance. And so I knew it was raid time. And by the time I finished the raid, I completely forgot that I was building earlier. So that's a good way to get people into the flow channel, is by heavily implying a choice. And if they don't want to take that choice, then that's fine. It just helps guide the players towards something.
And definitely through these implied choices, it can also kind of shake up your plans a bit. For example, a pillager patrol coming at just the right time, perhaps when you're not in god armor or really prepared for it, making a raid farm or something, versus if you find one in your first couple days. If it's right in the middle there, you can say, alright, well, it's there, I might as well try out a raid. And then that time you might be really challenged, but not too challenged, because then you'd be anxious, but you're not bored either. So it's like that you naturally regulate your flow state in Minecraft through these challenges that present themselves, and you have the option to take them or not.
Yeah, so that leads us to the point about talking about game mechanics now. So there's a couple important terms to know. The biggest game mechanic is probably space. That's just where the game takes place. It can be discrete or infinite. In Minecraft case, it's infinite along the X and Y axis, theoretically infinite, and it's finite on the Y axis. And there's also the 3 dimensions, both literally and narratively. Then there's objects, attributes, and states. So objects are the actual things in the game, like the player, the mobs, and they have attributes like health, damage taken, damage done, and state, like how much health you have. And they also have actions that they can take. So a player can place blocks, remove blocks, creepers can blow things up. And so something to keep in mind is you maximize game depth by adding attributes and actions to objects, and you maximize game breadth by adding objects. Emergence is caused by adding as many actions to objects as you can. For example, redstone torches and redstone dust. Let's just pretend that those are the only redstone items in the game. They still do a lot of things. And that's where we get emergent behaviors, like people being able to make calculators and big computers just with those two components. If there was one object which did every single one of those things, then it would be very overwhelming, very complicated, very inelegant. So elegance is when you have as many actions as possible with as few amount of objects as you can. This does sacrifice character though. A good example of character is instead of having zombies that do melee and another zombie which shoots you with a bow, those are separated into two different objects, zombies and skeletons. That's character. So you need to decide if you want to add more objects or actions. It's generally better to be able to do more things than have more things, but as a designer, it's up to you to make that decision. Keep in mind secrets as well. Decide what attributes and actions you want to show and hide. Horses, for example, that shows you its health attribute, but its jump height and speed is hidden, and that's pretty important because it means that players aren't overwhelmed with all the information that you see about the horse. They only see the health, and that's probably, for a new player, the most relevant thing to them. But if you really wanted to find out its jump height and speed, you can actually just build things to find out. And I think that's way better than just outright telling the player. Like, they have to actually decide how they want to figure that out. Whereas you can't really do the same thing with health, because you would kill the horse if you wanted to test that. So it just gets displayed to you outright, which I think is a pretty good design decision.
Yeah. And not to mention that when I have a bunch of horses, I might be encouraged to build a horse stable to house them, and then some hurdles or even just simple pillars where I can test their jump height. And then that gives me practice in jumping, because I need to hit the sweet spot or they'll jump their highest in order to accurately record their height. And then for the speed, I could create a redstone contraption that could record the time between 2 points. And there's all these ways that the player can figure out how to test these attributes. And that's special because the player has to figure things out themselves. And that's emergence. If you have a couple of things that when you put them together, they can be more than the sum of their parts, that means they aren't immediately obvious to the player, so the player can figure out how to use these things together. And not only does that make the player feel like they've created something new, it might actually be something new, because innovation happens all the time in Minecraft, in the technical community for example. And the observer block added in 1.11 has a very simple function. It detects state changes. But the way that it detects these and the way you can put them together with other redstone components opens up many more possibilities.
Okay, so RNG, that's random number generator for those who don't know, is just the easiest way to create surprises, assuming it's not white noise. Now what I mean by white noise is if you just generate colored noise on paint or something, it is as random as it can possibly be. But the problem is that if you generate white noise, it all looks the same, even though it's completely different to each other. And the reason is because of pattern recognition. So you have to have some control over how you want your random number generators, otherwise it just feels like white noise. So RNG is really good for surprises, but there are many caveats like that. Another one being that RNG can create situations where the player ends up grinding for too long. And I have a good example here. So we're all familiar with the skeletons, I think. They have like a 2.5% chance to drop a skull, I think, with looting 3. So you can kill 600 wither skeletons, and if you're really unlucky, you still won't get a skull. And that's really grindy for a lot of people, and probably not fair, and it puts people in the boredom part of the flow channel. So I would borrow from a solution from a game called Dark Souls. Maybe you've heard of it. Basically, they manipulate RNG to be a bit more fair. There's a boar helmet, for example. If you kill a boar, there's a 25% chance it will drop. Sure, but if you kill the third one, it's a 100% chance to drop, because by the time you've killed the third boar, the game just says, okay, you've earned it, here you go. So you can apply that to wither skeletons. So let's say I've got a 0.5% chance of getting a wither skull from a skeleton, but that chance increases every time I kill the wither skeleton. So by the time I get to the 100th one, there's just a 100% chance you'll get the wither skull, and by then you've definitely earned it, and there's no reason to encourage the player to grind beyond that.
And then taking this design decision from Dark Souls to Minecraft, two very different games. So what works for one game won't necessarily work for another. For example, Minecraft, even Minecraft Dungeons, it's got this idea of the player gains its powers through the stuff that it has. There's nothing that the player keeps when it dies in Minecraft, and also in Minecraft Dungeons, there's no kind of class that you have to stick to. Your class, whether you're a magic or a tank or an archer or a melee, that can all change depending on what you have. So essentially, you are what you have in Minecraft. So the idea of having this permanent chance of dropping wither skulls increasing the more that you've gotten, that might necessarily not be the best for Minecraft. So instead of having that, you could have some other way for the game to tell that you get the wither skulls. The more that you get, the better chance that you have of getting them, because the more that you've earned them. So, for example, you could have some sort of hidden adrenaline meter, or just something with a simple indicator. The more that you kill, the adrenaline meter goes up, and it raises your chances of getting skulls, and then after, it slowly decays. Whether you'd see that, or whether it just be some sort of effect, or some other way of saying it, well, that's all part of the process of iteration. Just like I've iterated on the idea of borrowing the mechanic from Dark Souls, you can continue to iterate that using what we've described before to make it more Minecrafty and more fun as a game mechanic, and to better solve the problem, etc.
Yeah, I was just thinking that that adrenaline system would be like an example of an attribute that you might want to decide to keep secret, a bit like saturation.
Yeah.
So that brings us on to balance. It doesn't, but we're going to talk about it anyway. So an easy way to balance ideas is through triangularity. So you get two choices. One is very risky, but very rewarding. And one is not risky and not rewarding. And the choice that the player will make will depend on their current state in the flow channel. If they're feeling anxious, they'll choose the low risk one, and if they're feeling bored, they'll choose the high risk one. So be careful about this though, because if there's more choices than the player desires, then the game can get confusing. But if there's more desires the player has than choices, then the game can get really frustrating. Also, be careful about being unoriginal here. I see a lot of games and mods and things that they'll provide you with 3 weapons. One is very fast, but doesn't do a lot of damage. One is kind of in the middle, and one's very slow, but does a lot of damage. That can be really boring for a lot of people, and you risk creating a dominant strategy with overpowered items. So a dominant strategy is like the most optimal way to play a game. And players will often choose this, even if it's the least fun. So be careful about that kind of stuff. Make sure you're being a little bit more original, and incentivize players to use strategies that seem less dominant. And that's just part of iteration as well. If you're finding that your players are just doing one thing over and over again, then it's probably time to either buff the other choices or nerf that particular one in some way, or add appeal to the other choices.
This is something else I see a lot in the community. There's some people who label something as OP or overpowered, and as before, we gotta ask why. Why is this overpowered, and why is that a bad thing? I mean, it might seem obvious, but it's always good to figure out why, so we can explore other options. So if something being overpowered leads to use of that thing being the dominant strategy, there's no reason to try anything else, which reduces variety in gameplay. And that makes it less like a game, because a game is a form of media where the player has choices.
Yeah. So, the way you make something powerful or underpowered, or balancing in general, is through rewards and punishments. So I'm going to list a bunch of rewards here that you can give your player. So one is praise, like, well done, you did it. The advancement system does that. It says, advancement get. That's an example of praise. That's a reward. There's points. Doesn't really apply to Minecraft so much, but there is that score that you do get on the death screen. Prolonged play. This applies mostly to hardcore mode, where the reward for surviving is to play the game for longer and be in your world for longer. That's what we mean by prolonged play. There's gateways. So obviously the reward for getting obsidian is a gateway to the nether. There's spectacle. So fireworks, when you add dyes to them, they look cool. That's a spectacle reward. Same with putting fireworks in your crossbow. That's an example of spectacle. Free expression. So dyeing your horse, adding a banner to your shield. Those are all expression rewards. Power, that should be a pretty obvious one. Resources, that is another obvious one. And completion of the game, which doesn't really apply to Minecraft that much, but people have decided that killing the Ender Dragon is completing the game, so that would be an example of reward applied to Minecraft. Be careful with rewards though, because if you dish them out too often, they'll get really boring. Netherrack isn't a fun reward, even though it's technically a resource. If you get Netherrack all the time, then it just means nothing. Gilded Blackstone, on the other hand, it's not particularly a useful block, but because you don't get it often, it feels more rewarding to have it. Try and relate rewards as well. Don't make it so something gives just praise and nothing else, or prolonged play and nothing else. Try and give like a combination of each type of reward, and people will like that a lot more. So rewards are pretty useless without punishments to go with them. Diamonds are more worthwhile because they can be taken away from you, and that's something to keep in mind. And just resources in general. Diamonds was just an example. So there's different kinds of punishments that you can dish out. So one is shaming. There's the classic "you died" screen. That's an example of shaming. Loss of points, shortened play, setbacks, removal of power. Be very careful with that one. I've seen one game do it, and it was the final boss, which de-levels you if it hits you with a certain move. So just be careful with that one, because players don't really like it. And resource depletion. That's a pretty common one. It can be phrased in a way that doesn't feel like a punishment as well. Like putting coal in a furnace, that's technically resource depletion, and that's technically a punishment, but it doesn't feel like one. It just feels like something that you have to pay in order to get the reward, which outweighs the punishment. So something to keep in mind is that punishments generally reinforce behaviors a lot stronger than rewards. People err on the side of safety, so keep that in mind. Big punishments feel very awful as well. So instead of giving out one massive punishment for something, try lots of small punishments. So you could have a system where if something happens to you, you get shamed a bit, you get set back a little bit of power gets removed, and a little bit of resources get removed, rather than having all your resources removed at once. Minecraft does suffer from that just a little bit, where it just takes everything away from you if you die, but it does kind of counteract this by allowing you to get some of your stuff back if you can. That generally puts people in the anxiety side of the flow channel, so just be careful of that. So there are a couple questions that you need to ask before adding a punishment in the game, and that's: what punishments already exist? Are the existing punishments fair? Could you use a reward instead of a punishment? Famous example from World of Warcraft. They added a system where the more you play, the less experience you get over time, unless you have a break and come back. Players hated this because it just felt awful, like watching the number go down. So in order to address this, the developers just said, hey, if you take a break and come back, we'll give you an experience bonus. And the numbers were the same, they just rephrased how they did it, and it just felt like a reward rather than a punishment. So you can phrase things differently, and players will respond differently. You don't have to just change the mechanics. Something else to keep in mind is if the punishments are stronger than the rewards. If they are, then players will almost never seek the reward, because, like I said, punishments are weighted stronger than rewards. So make sure that the reward is stronger than the punishment in most cases.
Yeah, Minecraft, this is a very big part of Minecraft because Minecraft's death system is probably the most dated mechanic that feels like it could do with a major revamp. Obviously, you know, there's caves and stuff, but not technically a mechanic as such. Death is the one that, you know, makes people rage quit or forces people to create backup gear just in case they die, etc. There's a lot of, just like Minecraft is a sandbox game, the consequences of death are also kind of sandboxy because it's up to the player how much they're prepared, how much they've risked, etc. So it's almost the punishments and rewards, I guess, are related in a way, but the player chooses how they're related. For example, shaming, you know, there's not much you can do about that, you just respawn. Loss of points, well, that's XP. You get about 7 levels of XP back, no matter how much you had before, which is probably something that needs to change, but that's loss of points. Shorten play, that's up to you really. If you want to rage quit, you rage quit. Or if you're in hardcore mode, you die, and you have to go into a spectator mode. Setbacks is definitely a big one because you're back at your base. If you've just started out, you pretty much have to start back from the beginning. If you've died in a cave or died in lava, lost all your iron, you didn't have a base, well, that's back to the drawing board for you. But if you're an endgame player and you've fallen in lava there and you've got several backup elytras and you've got an XP farm, you can get pretty much back to where you were before, with a couple of exceptions. It depends on how much you can be bothered to accumulate resources in the case of these, and how much things you don't have tied to your player. This is one thing that Minecraft does well, is because of how delicate and fragile your player is and its and the inventory, etc. It does encourage you to build bases with all your stuff in them and all the ways that you can quickly level back up and help other people. For example, if a new player joins, you can easily get them all the stuff. Not everyone's gonna want to do that. But removal of power, that's also very tied to setbacks because you are your items essentially. And resource depletion also ties into that because you lose whatever you have unless you can get it back. But lava is a big
Yeah.
setback enhancer.
I mean, they added netherite to kind of counteract the effect of the punishment of lava, right? So there are ways to kind of lessen the punishment for more experienced players if that's something that you want to do. Obviously, there are other things like fire resistance to get around the punishment entirely and just like mitigate the risk entirely. That kind of ties into triangularity as well. Using a fire resistance potion can be very low reward because it costs resources, but it also reduces the risk as well. So, whereas the alternative is like not spending resources on a fire resistance potion, but also that's a very high risk strategy. So that's like an example of triangularity placed there for punishments.
Yeah, when I was first trying out the Nether update, I initially, since they have the game rules on the selection screen, I kind of felt like they were less like cheating and more just like a config almost. So
yeah.
I'd set it to keep inventory, and I'd done it starting in the Nether, so I'm like, if I die, I'm going to rage quit. So I'm like, okay, I actually need to have keep inventory on to have fun. So I went and did some stuff, and, you know, if I died pretty quickly, but I'd also gotten a lot of stuff, and, you know, I don't want to go back to the beginning. The problem is, after a while, I got a little bit reckless. For example, if I got lost, you know, I just died, and then I'm back where I spawned. There's a lot of tweaking that goes into it. Turning keep inventory off or on, that's quite an extreme solution because it essentially takes away one of the worst punishments, which is losing XP and sometimes your entire inventory. So I'd like to look into other possible punishments that could serve as kind of a middle ground between losing almost everything and losing nothing. Something to keep me cautious, but not too severe.
I mean, there are items like the Totem of Undying, and I think they could probably expand on systems like that to just lessen the blow when you lose all your health.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like whether it's this is just me speaking. I don't know if this is tied to good game design, but I feel like in some cases they're too worried about changing existing systems, so they keep adding stuff on. So, for example, the death system, you've got netherite, so that some of your items don't burn, especially probably your most prized ones. The Totem of Undying now gives you fire resistance. That's another way to mitigate it. But both of those are pretty in-game, and they don't cover everyone. And then all the stuff before, you're like, okay, so why do I only get a maximum of 7 levels back? Like, no matter how many levels I have on me, why can I only get a maximum of 7? Does that need an item to mitigate it, some sort of XP storage, or should that mechanic be completely revised? Like maybe you keep half of your XP, or maybe even the basic idea of the more levels you have, the less the XP contributes to your bar. Should that be a thing? Like, there's a lot of things that you could go back and look at there. I'm not sure if Mojang would, because they don't want to make these mechanics more confusing, or they haven't got around to it yet. It's the same with the skulls. They're less important because people hate them, and also it's a smaller part of the game. It's not an overarching mechanic. The wither boss is locked behind it, but it's not as basic as dying and XP. Another one is enchanting. You know, they've added so many things. First you needed 50 levels, and then you need 30, which is better. Then you need lapis, and it takes away less, which is better. But then along came book enchanting and mending, which pretty much made durability not an issue in game. There's a lot of things that they're building on it with that philosophy of you are your items. But sometimes I feel like they need to look at the most basic foundational things and say, okay, should that be how it is right now?
And you'd solve that by phrasing all of those problems as problem statements and then iterating on solutions. I know that's like easier said than done, but that would be the process in which you do to solve it, which we've outlined in the rest of this podcast.
Yeah, these sorts of systems that I've been looking at, saying, I don't like death, I don't like enchanting, I've come up with basic solutions for them. For example, some sort of way to select your enchantments, which could tie in with progression. But ultimately, when you're dealing with these basic systems, very foundational, very old, that a lot of players depend on, especially the popular players who play in-game and know them inside out, these sorts of things you can't change lightly. For example, Vazkey made a mod called Unmending, which changed mending essentially that it would reset the XP so that you could keep repairing your stuff through an anvil so it doesn't say too expensive. And barely anyone liked that. It's hard to take away people's toys, as he said in the podcast that I did with them. So when you're changing these basic systems, you have to have a really, really good knowledge of the player base and these strategies and basically everything we've outlined in this podcast. And this has been a major step in my game design journey as well, because, before I've been working on stuff like, okay, how do I fix this single feature? How do I change this? Versus a whole mechanic that's been around for ages and everyone relies on. That's something that you really have to put a lot of thought into, and you can't just come up with an idea like that to solve it and just iterate a few times. You got to consider all these different things, which is why game design is such a complex job sometimes, because you've got so much to consider. You have to stand back and look at it holistically. You have to look at every single different part. When people are like, oh yeah, I'm an idea guy, I come up with ideas. But game design, if you go beyond that and look at how these ideas are come up with and how they're polished and balanced and all these things that you need to take into consideration, it's a rabbit hole. It's a lot more complex than it first appears. And that's why I respect the job that Mojang has designing for the most popular game of all time.
Yeah, and if you're the kind of person who considers themselves just an idea guy, then it's probably a good idea to reevaluate what position that you want. And that kind of brings us on to the design team. So you've got your idea, or maybe you've got a team that has a bunch of ideas. Ideas shouldn't just belong to you. That's when you start putting together your design team. So when you're putting together your design team, something to consider is diversity in skill. There should be someone who's good at art, someone who's good at tech, someone who's good at design, and someone who's jack of all trades, those kinds of things, and their positions should interlock, especially if you're working in a smaller team. And the important thing about not being an ideas guy is divorcing yourself from ownership, because if you have to work in a team, you have to make every decision unanimous. If you're working with a team, don't say my idea, say the Phantom's idea, so you can involve everyone. Otherwise, you're going to have some big problems if you're trying to develop. So try and make every decision unanimous. Iterate on your problems until everyone likes it. Team members will have different visions to you, and you got to work with them. So establish the vision really early on, so there's less chance of schisms happening, which you don't want to have happen. Another problem with being an ideas guy is that you may let other opinions threaten your status as a designer. Do not let that happen, because if you withdraw from the opinions of others, then your game will dry up, or mod, or whatever it is you're working on. Always put yourself in the shoes of people who have different opinions and interpret the best possible version of what they're saying. So if someone suggests something and it's a bad idea, and let's say it is actually garbage, do not actually say this is garbage. That's just terrible feedback. Say something like, I think that the art direction could go towards this kind of style, or maybe we should change a couple of these mechanics. That's something I see mostly in suggestions forums and things like that. Someone will just outright say that a feature is garbage and usually don't elaborate. That's not helpful in any way. You don't want to be doing that. Avoid overfleshing your design early on if you're working on a team. You need to allow some ambiguity to allow for people to contribute somehow. Like I said, that's also divorcing yourself from the idea of being the ideas guy, because you have to involve everyone in the brainstorming process. And lastly, if you're working in a team, always be clear. Don't say, I'll be finished with this on Thursday. Say, I'll be finished with this on 5 p.m. Thursday. Don't say I'm working on the skeleton mob. Say I'm working on the skeleton walking behavior of this particular mob, and things like that. Those kinds of things will help you with unity in the team. I'll repeat myself, do not be the ideas guy if you're trying to work on a team. It is very dangerous and probably will not help the long-term health of your game or mod.
Yeah, the difference between an ideas guy and a game designer is anyone can be an idea guy. Anyone doing art, they might have a cool block or a mob that they want to put in the game, but they don't have the idea of the mechanics, or maybe they do, but they could do with a little bit of tweaking. Same with tech, design, anyone can be an ideas guy, but the role of the designer is to try and put these ideas together in a consistent vision, and do so while respecting the opinions of others and including everyone in the process. You're all in this together. You're not trying to argue with your teammates, because you're both trying to make something that you're proud of. They're your friends, not your enemies. And if they're your enemies, then not sure what to do there. But basically, you're all in a team. You've all got your own roles. And if you're good at coming up with ideas, then why not help other people with the ideas and integrate your ideas together so you can come up with something even better than the sum of their parts. The role of a designer is much more than making ideas. You've got all the stuff to consider that we've just talked about, and also other people's opinions to consider. There's a lot that goes into it, and it's not something taken lightly.
Yeah, it's a good point about being the difference between being an ideas guy and a designer. On some level, every person who works on a team is a designer in their own right, because they're adding their own artistic flares to whatever it is they're producing. And if you try and take ownership of ideas, then that will clash with their interests, and that's not something that you want. Especially if you're actually looking to work in the games industry at some point, there's rarely a position which is ideas guy. Like, that just doesn't really happen unless you're some kind of celebrity.
Or if you've been working there for a long time, you end up being a creative officer or something that has to handle the brand and all the stuff to make it consistent if the game has grown to that point. Kind of like Jeb. He doesn't code as much as he did before. He's doing the combat snapshots, but his position as chief creative officer, because he's been at the game for so long and knows it very well and knows the secret lore that only he knows and stuff like that. He's earned his position.
Yeah.
Specifically, don't say my idea. About that is that, when you say it's your idea, you personalize it and you kind of attach yourself to it. So if someone has a problem with idea, you could view that as being an attack on you, versus if you say, this is an idea that I had, and then just refer to it as whatever the idea is. For example, if you had an idea for improving phantoms, you could say the phantom idea, etc. Divorcing it from yourself makes it a lot easier for you to tweak it, because it feels less like you're compromising on yourself and more like you're compromising with others. So you can come up with something that much better than you could have come up with on your own, just because you haven't made it yours and made it part of your identity.
Yeah, that's a really good note. So let's summarize everything we've talked about. So you come up with an experience, and then you rephrase it as a problem statement, and then you iterate on that problem until it's solved. You do this through prototyping, create something really quick and dirty, practice deep listening to your various different play types and keep the flow channel in mind. Think about what game mechanics you have, think about the space, how many objects you have, how many attributes they have, which attributes you keep hidden, how many actions they have. Think about the role of RNG in your game, and if you decide to use it or not, what purpose it's filling, and if you could go about the same purpose using something that isn't RNG. Keep balance in mind with your rewards and punishments, keep triangularity in mind, and don't be an ideas guy on your design team.
Yeah, you're all in this together. You're all trying to make a game that works, and unless you're the head of it, or the client, or someone in this position that can afford to do that, then you're one of the team as well, and you gotta pull your own weight, and you gotta help others to make the great game that you all know you can make.
Awesome.
All right, should we wrap it up there then?
Yeah, I think that's covering everything. That's just the fundamentals, by the way. There are other topics like game feel, which we haven't gone into. Maybe we'll do that another time.
There's a lot to game design. We've covered the stuff that is specific to Minecraft, but there are all sorts of other chapters that we've just skipped over from the book. So if you want a more well-rounded idea of game design in general, you can do that.
Yeah, the book is crazy in depth. Like, it talks about marketing terms and sales pitches and things like that. So if the gaming industry is something that you're interested in, then that book is basically a must-read.
All right, we done then?
Yeah, I think that's everything.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on the show, Zoe. That was a good one to add to the Minecraft Ideas Academy podcast.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you all for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, let us know by leaving a like. And if you really enjoy what we do, please consider supporting me on Patreon. You'll also get access to secret mod and Nether extension betas. There will be more episodes of the Minecraft Ideas Academy later on, so if that interests you, subscribe and hit the bell, and soon it should be up for you to enjoy. Links to Zoe's Twitter and the Art of Game Design PDF are in the description of this video. Until next time, stay abnormal. Special thanks to Adele, Piemaster651, Swaff, Vinny, and Stephanie for pledging $5, Jabbalub, Connor, Ava, Grin, and Cat Scythe for pledging $10, and Aldakor for pledging $12. Thank you for all your support.